It looked like the informant had gotten it wrong. Nothing had happened all that weekend. So they called off the stakeout, except for one detective. He went home, but then he had what he called a bad feeling. So after the stakeout had been called off, the officers had all got home, this one police detective just felt wrong. He got out of bed in the middle of the night and he went back to the location. And sure enough, his bad feeling was right on target. At about 3 a.m., somebody pulled into the parking lot of the site they had been staking out. This person got out of the car, walked over to the building the police had been watching, and that person put down what turned out to be a bomb at the door of the building. The person then got back into the car, started to drive away. The police detective stopped the car a short distance away, arrested the man who had placed the bomb. The man was, weirdly, wearing a woman's wig. He was also carrying a handgun. A few months later, that man gave up his co-conspirators in the bombing plot, including a woman who helped plan the bombing and the bomb itself and the disguise for the bomber. This woman had procured gunpowder and some of the other supplies for the bomb. She'd also obtained the wig used in the disguise, and she had provided the wig to the bomber. The bomb was not only the real deal, it was of substantial size. Investigators said it could have done real damage. The only reason it didn't go off is that after the bomber had lit the fuse blew out in the wind. The building they tried to blow up that July weekend in 1987, it was a clinic that did abortions. And the woman who provided all the bomb-making supplies and the wig was a radical anti-abortion activist named Cheryl Sullinger. Cheryl Sullinger went to prison for 2 years for that plot. And when she got out, she stayed part of the radical anti-abortion movement. She's in it for the long haul. A few years after she got out of prison, another radical anti-abortion activist named Paul Hill assassinated a doctor in Pensacola, Florida, a doctor named John Britton. He killed John Britton along with a U.S. Air Force retired lieutenant colonel who was acting as the doctor's bodyguard. He also wounded the colonel's wife, who was acting as a clinic escort. Anti-abortion activist Paul Hill was arrested after those killings. He was convicted of capital murder. Again, Cheryl Sullinger was out of prison herself by then. When it came time for Paul Hill to have his sentence brought to bear, when it came time for Paul Hill to be executed by the state of Florida for those murders, Cheryl Sullinger put out a statement saying that Paul Hill should have been allowed to argue that what he did was justifiable homicide because, quote, the killing of the abortionist was necessary. At roughly the same time, Cheryl Sullinger also co-authored a book which castigates the U.S. government for not putting abortion providers to death in this country, for not killing abortion providers. Quote, in addition to our personal guilt in abortion, the U.S. government has abrogated its responsibility to properly deal with the blood guilty. This responsibility rightly involves executing convicted murderers, including abortionists, for their crimes in order to expunge blood guilt from the land and people. Cheryl Sullinger's co-author on both that book and on the statement about it being justifiable homicide to murder the Florida abortion doctor. Her co-author in both of those instances, on the book and on the statement, her co-author is this guy, Troy Newman. Troy Newman is president of a group called Operation Rescue. And whether you are involved in the politics of abortion or not, you probably have a clear idea in your mind of what Operation Rescue is. In the 1980s and 90s, Operation Rescue was widely known for protests like the Summer of Mercy protests they pulled off in Wichita, Kansas, these mass physical blockades of abortion clinics. Operation Rescue has a hard time pulling off protests like that anymore. Now Operation Rescue does stuff like Troy Newman going out to California this past summer to inform Californians that he had figured out why there's a drought in that state.
The land was polluted. With innocent blood. Is it no wonder that California is experiencing the worst drought in history? It is the largest chapter in all of the United States. There's no coincidences with God.
So some of what they do is slightly on the goofy, if apocalyptic side, right? Blaming the California drought on abortion being legal in California. But even when they are inadvertently goofy, Operation Rescue has always been deliberately intimidating. The reason they were founded, their specific reason for being in the radical anti-abortion movement has been a strategy of personally harassing and individually targeting doctors, while also, honestly, being associated with and defending people who kill or try to kill such doctors. Cheryl Sullinger, the convicted clinic bomber, is Operation Rescue's senior vice president. They now, to this day, maintain a website dedicated to putting up pictures of individual doctors who do abortions and putting up their addresses and how to find them. In 2002, Operation Rescue moved the headquarters of their national operation to Kansas, specifically to target one particular Kansas abortion doctor named Dr. George Tiller. When another radical anti-abortion activist, in fact, killed Dr. George Tiller in Kansas in 2009, when police arrested him after the killing, they found on his dashboard a piece of paper with a phone number on it for Operation Rescue, specifically the phone number for Cheryl Sillinger at Operation Rescue. That said, she and Troy Newman have denied having any substantive contact with the man who murdered Dr. George Tiller. Well, this past weekend, one of the groups that reports on the activities of way out there folks like Cheryl Sillinger and Troy Newman, the group People for the American Way, this weekend they sort of lost their minds. They saw their own proverbial hair proverbially spontaneously combust when a joint press release was issued by Troy Newman and leading Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz. Said Ted Cruz, quote, "I'm grateful to receive the endorsement of Troy Newman. We need leaders like Troy Newman in this country who will stand up for those who do not have a voice." Ted Cruz is having kind of a moment in the presidential race. Donald Trump is obviously winning in the Republican contest overall, but Ben Carson's on the decline, and it seems like Ted Cruz is taking Dr. Carson's evangelical supporters, particularly in Iowa. In today's latest Iowa poll from Quinnipiac, Ted Cruz is in second place in Iowa at 23%. That puts him only 2 points behind Donald Trump. Ted Cruz is having a moment. In coming days, we're going to have more on this show in terms of Ted Cruz's relationship to at least one religious leader who is loudly calling for the death penalty as the only just punishment for the crime of homosexuality in this country. But right now, Ted Cruz's courtship of the hard-right evangelical vote also extends to his warm welcome and praise for the endorsement of the Clinic Bombers co-author, who maintains the public list of abortion doctors' names and addresses and photos, who says that not just executing, but also vigilante murdering abortion doctors is at least arguably justifiable homicide. We reached out to the Ted Cruz campaign for comment. We have not heard back. I dearly hope that we do. We will keep you posted if we do. But this is one of those stories that I recognize the Beltway media doesn't sort of have its feelers out for. As Ted Cruz ascends in the polls and as his lift in the polls is driven basically entirely by very, very conservative religious right voters, this is part of understanding why, and this is one of the things that he should explain to people who may have some justifiable concerns about who he's building his campaign on now. That does it for us tonight. We will see you again tomorrow. Now it's time for the last word.